I'm David Caputo, Professor of Political Science at Pace University in New York City, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture on the Road to the White House Massive Open Online Course MOOC that I'm teaching this spring. It's the morning of March the 8th, the day of the Michigan and Mississippi primaries, the two most important things up today. I'll be discussing them, but before I do that, I want to give you an update as to where we stand in terms of delegate count at this point, and also I'll conclude by talking about what things look like going forward. All right, so to start with, let's talk about the Democrats first. At this point in time, Secretary Clinton has 1,129 delegates. Sanders has 498 delegates. Remember, you need 2,383 delegates. So while Mrs. Clinton is close to half, she is still not halfway there. And more importantly, if you deduct the superdelegates from her totals, okay, she would end up with 671. Okay? And then if you deduct the 22 superdelegates who supposedly are supporting Senator Sanders at this point, he ends up with 476. So what happens is it's about a 200 delegate lead if you take the superdelegates out. Remember, superdelegates are part of the Democratic formula. They're largely made up of office holders, members of Congress, members of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate, a variety of other important individuals around the country and so forth. But technically, those superdelegates do not have to pledge to a candidate till the actual convention. It was an attempt by the Democratic Party to make sure that their establishment was more in control of the actual nominee, because going into the convention with approximately 600 plus superdelegates, they're able to control a lot of things. How do we know that about 450 of these superdelegates have pledged for Secretary Clinton and 22 for Senator Sanders? It's from a series of polls that have been done, informal polls done, especially by the Associated Press, where they've contacted these individuals and asked them who they're supporting, and this has been the response. So what you see here is overwhelming support from the Democratic leadership and the so-called Democratic establishment for Secretary Clinton. We'll come back to that, especially in the next lecture, to talk a little bit more about this. So what this means then is that going forward, if Sanders and Clinton continue to split the votes 60, 40, 55, 45, and the delegates accordingly, it's numerically impossible for Senator Sanders to catch her. However, it is possible if he becomes the one getting 60 to 65%. He could actually be ahead of her, except for the superdelegates going into the convention. Whether or not that will happen or not, I think, is a bit problematic, but it is a possibility. So when people argue that Secretary Clinton has a lock on the Democratic nomination, that is not true. Okay? Senator Sanders is in position, given the money that he's raised, to really contest a lot of the upcoming primaries. So it would depend what happens there. Now let's switch for a moment to the Republicans. At this point in time, again, remember it's the morning of March 8th. Donald Trump has 384 delegates. Ted Cruz has 300. Rubio has 151. And Kasich has 37. You need 1,237 to receive the Republican nomination. Now this number 1237 will be something that you hear regularly. Why? Because you can see that Trump at 384 does not have a majority of the delegates that have been chosen so far. Despite his winning more states and more caucuses combined than the other candidates, he still is not ahead of them in terms of actual delegate count by a clear majority. That could change, but for now he does not have the nomination. Now on March the 8th, tonight, and by tomorrow morning, we'll know the results of two important primaries, Mississippi and Michigan. For the Republicans, Michigan is important because it's the first of the major industrial states in the North, and it will be interesting to see how Donald Trump runs there. Also has pockets of conservatism, mid-state and upstate Michigan, and we'll see how Cruz is able to run there. it appears that Marco Rubio is fading, and fading relatively quickly from this race, from the nominating race, for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless he is fading. He has a chance to come back. He has to come back, I would argue, to some extent on March 8th to position himself for March 15th. The second important race for the Republicans is Mississippi, and there it would be Trump and Cruz, and Cruz was expected to carry most of the Deep South. He has not been able to. Trump has been able to. So it will be interesting to see what happens to the Cruz vote in Mississippi and whether or not Trump carries Mississippi, and by what amount. Now, also, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Republican strategy, at least the so-called establishment strategy, going in after former Governor Romney's speech last week, in which Romney did a scorched earth attack on Donald Trump, arguing why he was unfit to be president, why he was unfit both personality-wise, policy-wise, experience-wise, name it. Romney attacked him on it. We don't know what the result of not only Romney's attack, but Mitch McConnell's and other establishment leadership Republican attacks on Trump, what that will do to him. It appears that it may slow his growth towards 40 and 50%, but his base, which has been running between 25 and 35%, may be staying about the same. That being the case, he's still in position to do very well in these primaries. Okay? So don't lose sight of that. Now, as far as the polling goes, it appears that Trump has a strong lead in Michigan, also a lead in Mississippi, with Cruz coming in second, but a distant second, and Rubio and Kasich maybe not being able to qualify in terms of the various proportions that they need to get delegates. So this particular race, Michigan, is extremely important because it sets up the March 15th races for the Republicans. And what do I mean by that? Well, on March 15th, you have races in Illinois, North Carolina, Missouri, Florida, and for John Kasich, the most important one is Ohio. Kasich has said he will carry Ohio. He has been behind in the polls, but recent polls show him gaining. And I would be very surprised if he did not win Ohio as an incumbent governor. This then positions him to carry the race on and positions him to do well in other large states such as Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New York, and other states. So if he is able to carry Ohio, it may give him some momentum, especially on the West Coast and other places. So watch for how he does as you get into the March 15th in the Ohio race. Now, what is being forgotten about in these races and in this discussion, everyone is centered on two states on the 15th, Florida and Ohio. Florida because the argument is Marco Rubio must carry that state in order to stay a viable candidate. I think most people would agree, given the recent polling, Rubio has zero chance of carrying Florida at this point. So now there's going to be pressure on him to drop out either before and swing and making it, in essence, a Kasich, Cruz, Trump contest, or dropping out afterwards if he doesn't do well. It's one of the interesting stories. A lot of interesting stories out of 2016. One is what happened to the Jeb Bush campaign, especially given the money that he had. Second, what has happened to the Marco Rubio campaign? Why has it fallen so flat? And what have been the voters' perceptions of that? So we'll have to wait and see. Things could change, but I think it's highly unlikely that Rubio will win Florida. Who does is likely to be Trump. Trump wins Florida, winner take all. He gets all of that state's delegates. Now, also on the 15th, however, are three other states which haven't gotten much attention. North Carolina, large number of, I believe, 72 delegates chosen there. Missouri, 50-plus delegates chosen there. Illinois, over 70 delegates chosen there. So these are important races for the GOP. And you wonder, since there hasn't been a lot of statewide polling in these three states, what is likely to happen? Will Illinois reflect what happens in Michigan and Ohio, or will Illinois be different? So March 15th is an extremely important date. It's an extremely important date for another key reason. At the conclusion of voting on March 15th, the Republicans will have chosen about 50% of their delegates. So that means only 50% left to remain to be chosen. The Democrats will have chosen about 60% of their delegates. So if Sanders is to figure out a way to catch up or surpass Secretary Clinton in terms of non-superdelegates, he's going to have to do it through the 15th, or it becomes increasingly difficult to do going on. All right. Now let's talk for just one final second then about the Democrats. Here, with these 5 states, Missouri, North Carolina, Illinois, Ohio, and Florida, okay, with Mrs. Clinton having a large lead in Florida, should have a reasonable lead in the state of Ohio, but Ohio could be very fertile ground for Sanders, given his appeal to white males. And we'll see how he runs in Michigan, which is similar to Ohio in a lot of ways. And then you get into the more wild card states such as North Carolina and Missouri. And not a lot of work, not a lot of polling done there. It will be very interesting to see how the candidates how Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders approach that particular set of contests. Now remember again that when you get to March 15th, the Democrats will have picked about 60% of their delegates, the Republicans a little bit right around 50%. So you can see you're getting at halfway point, and it's depending on how you look at it, it's either still uphill or it's downhill going forward. Remember, we started February 1st. It'll be the 6 weeks in. 6 weeks later, it's only the 1st of May, and you still have a number of significant primaries left, including the California primary, which may decide a number of things. But I would argue, just at this point, before the primaries on the 8th and the 15th, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Trump to be able to get his majority of delegates at this point. That could change. Winning in Ohio, winning in Florida, everything changes. Splitting into 2, possibly. Losing both, very difficult then to go on. So the attempts to block Trump may in fact have their last major stand on March 15th. So we'll watch that and we'll comment about that on the next, after March 15th and the lecture that I give then. I think I'm going to conclude here. I want to come back in the next lecture and talk about why all the emphasis has been on the Republican difficulties. I want to talk about something that very few people are talking about at this point, but which needs to be raised, and that is the problems on the Democratic side and the chances that they're going to get into a contested election. So that'll be the topic for the next lecture. Thank you.